Good morning, afternoon, evening, and good night, friends. I'm Alexis Goldstein, here with my co-host Jesse Meyerson for the 21st episode of Disorderly Conduct, our finance and economics podcast with Tarbell NYC.
We're going to highlight a whole potpourri of internet things for you today, listeners, in a new segment we're calling A-D-H-DisCon.
Incompetent Democratic politicians.
And why property destruction is a legitimate protest tactic.
Why business travel is for assholes.
And how bullshit is driving the stock market.
Finally, I spoke to Eugene Puryear, a socialist who's running for the D.C. Council, about his vision for the District of Columbia. Spoiler alert, that includes a public bank, taking private utility companies public, and a $15 per hour minimum wage.
And as always, if you enjoy the show, subscribe and rate us on iTunes or on Stitcher, and swipe right on Tinder, and please respond to anything we say on the program and add your thoughts under the hashtag DisCon.
And away we go.
All right, before we get to our new segment, A-D-H-DisCon, I feel that it is incumbent upon me, since I challenged Alexis to something of a duel last time, to update you on how that went. If you'll recall, we argued about the First Lady's Vine, turn up for what. Alexis was pro on the grounds that people are racist to the First Lady, and this is a big fuck you to them. I objected on the grounds that it's neoliberal, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, victim-blamey policy, her whole thing about fitness and healthy eating. And the people spoke, and I received an absolute thrashing at the hands of DisCon
Yeah, Jesse
listeners.
lost pretty bad.
So bad. I think I basically lost count. It might have been like 8-2, and the two people who sided with me were, one admitted to being a pity vote, and the other one was like, I'm not sure I totally agree with you, I just didn't really like the Vine. So I totally fucked the pooch on that one. Either that or you guys did, and I had more faith in you than you deserved.
No, I think the people spoke, and they spoke the truth.
They spoke the truth. You beat me on that one. All right. Well, I'll do a rematch at some point. We'll think of something else to argue about. But for now, Alexis, you have a piece in The Guardian about this upcoming, or probably current, election cycle, if the media is to be believed. Tell us about it.
So, Jesse, I finally got to do what I think you have a lot of fun doing all the time, and talk a little bit about solutions instead of just talking about how shitty everything is, although I did a little bit of that at the same time.
Yeah, that's the best. That's the best. You don't have to choose one or the other.
Yeah, just combining those two things together into the perfect rage smash piece. So the New York Times had an article the day before, basically, I wrote this, saying that the Democrats were absolutely desperate to turn out the black vote, because without it, they just think that they're absolutely doomed in this midterm election. And they have also been talking about how they've been desperate for the youth vote and the Latino vote. And so my question essentially in this piece is, I understand that you want to turn out minorities and young people, but what have you actually done for them? And if you really want to make people motivated to vote for you, shouldn't you be calling for bold policy changes that would actually have a meaningful impact in their lives? Obviously, they've failed to do that in the lead up to the midterms, but I suppose it's never too late to at least pander. But I basically gave them two specific things that they could do, one of which doesn't even require Congress. So the first one is about housing and about the lack of affordable housing, which longtime listeners will have heard us talk about on the show before. There is actually a law currently banning the construction of new public housing. It's something called the Fair Cloth Limit. And again, we've talked about it before. However, there is in existence a law that establishes something called the National Housing Trust Fund. This was signed into law by President Bush, and the idea is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are supposed to take their profits and put a portion of their profits into this trust fund. And this trust fund has a bunch of strict rules around it. It's supposed to either build new affordable housing, which is slightly different than public housing, or repair existing public housing with the money that comes from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And the argument was that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the wake of the crisis was really precarious and they couldn't afford to pay into this fund. But in the wake of the crisis, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been really profitable. And so there's no real reason why they can't start paying money into the trust fund. But this guy named Ed DeMarco, who was kind of made into a boogeyman by the Obama administration, was blocking it. So the Obama administration and a bunch of progressive groups kicked him out, put in this so-called progressive named Mel Watt, but Mel Watt hasn't done anything about this since he's taken office. So I challenge the Democrats to basically move on this. And the second thing is a little bit easier to explain. The second thing is, hey, you want students to vote? Why don't you get behind free public higher education? None of this, let's lower the rates, let's refinance the rates. Like, actually go out there on the limb and call for free public education. And then I pointed back to this strike debt proposal that shows how you can do that by moving some money around and then just throwing an extra $15 billion a year at the problem.
I feel like the free public education thing would definitely cater to the youth vote. The question is if it would like set off everybody's debt and deficit like frenzy meters too much in order to do it. But the other one, the other one obviously would be really good. Obviously I'm fully in support of the Democrats running on both of these things and think that if they were truly a party of workers and a broad-based sort of working class coalition, then they would see that was in their best interest. But I wonder if like how much actual political benefit is to be gained from campaigning on like public and affordable housing. I mean, maybe it would, just because like there's not like an urbanist agenda in the United States, and there's obviously a huge housing crisis, like housing affordability crisis in lots of urban centers. So maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, maybe it's a little too technical. I mean, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, obviously you're proposing it.
I think it would be important because, I mean, Elizabeth Warren is stumping for some of the people who are in tight Senate races now. And when she even talks about her refinancing student loans bill, she gets this huge thunderous applause. So can you imagine how motivated people would be if instead of talking about this solution at the margin, she was going full tilt? We need to bring back, tuition-free public higher ed like we used to have in this country, at least in California and in New York. And I think, housing is at crisis levels. And this is something I mentioned in the Guardian piece, but a huge amount of people, a record amount of people became what's called worst case housing needs during Obama's tenure, which basically means either you live in a slumlord, like falling apart, rat-infested apartment, or you pay more than 50% of your income in rent. And that's, that is a real problem. And I think real solutions to that would really speak to people and make them motivated in a way that they're totally not motivated right now.
Yeah, there's one more thing that I think they should definitely all be running on. I was talking to David Kaib in D.C. the other day, and he's a big proponent of something else that Elizabeth Warren is out front on, which is expanding Social Security. I think that's a really winning issue, and there's only 5 candidates, according to David, who are running on it, which is stupid, and obviously it testifies to the fact that the Democrats are the party of finance.
And just the one last thing on this, which is just, I understand that like talking about free public higher ed will scare Republicans and may motivate them to vote, but those are the people who are already motivated to vote. They're already going to be voting. So you don't lose anything by pissing them off, and you only have upside in terms of possibly motivating Democrats who are currently, kind of like, meh, should I vote? Meh.
And speaking of things that make right-wingers shit their diapers, can we move on to the second in our A-D-H-DisCon series, which is a thing that I wrote with friend of the show, Chepe, who in this byline in Rolling Stone online is Jose Martin, called Smashy Smashy, 9 historical triumphs to make you rethink property destruction. So halfway, this is like continuing the like radical left-wing like listicle Rolling Stone thing that I'm trying to gin up. But partly, I mean, the main thing was that we were watching all of this coverage of Ferguson, and like, as always, there's a bunch of people who, whenever somebody smashes something or sets a trash can on fire, or God forbid, like they did in Ferguson, sets the flag on fire, everybody just goes completely haywire and starts just peeing all over the place, and shaking their fingers, wagging their fingers. How dare you? You're the bad protesters. These are the good protesters. Those are the bad protesters. And it's, of course, they like don't do the same thing when there's like drunken white college students rioting, like in New Hampshire we saw with Pumpkin Fest. But they love to do this with marginalized communities or left-wing groups, separate the good from the bad protesters and condemn property destruction. But really, I think the critical thing is that double standard, right? Like, people aren't actually against property destruction because they root for it when it's on their team. They just are
Right.
into their team and into condemning the other team. And that's all there is to it. And I wish we would just get real about that. So we provided 9 pieces of property destruction, including some that are like really trolly for those people, the Boston Tea Party, taking down the Berlin Wall, but also some really amazing stuff. The Mi'kmaq indigenous resistance to fracking, Nelson Mandela, and the MK, which is his group, sort of a guerrilla group alongside the South African Communist Party, whose activities got him known as a terrorist to Western governments. A bunch of cool stuff. So just to show that, like, look, property destruction obviously may not be wise in every situation, and the question, like, should X do property destruction in order to further their political goals, that's like up to circumstance and politics and all sorts of stuff. But the question, like, is property destruction a legitimate protest tactic in cases? The answer is obviously yes, and we just wanted to show that to shut everybody up about their finger wagging.
Well, and it's interesting because it makes me think of the way that we sort of sanitize our heroes, and I think about the way that, Malcolm X is on a stamp now, while at the time, like, people were so afraid of him, and the way that Nelson Mandela is held up now, even by people like Grover Norquist. And I guess quick little side story I should tell folks, I was on CNN once with Grover Norquist, and this dude brought up apartheid South Africa as a way to try to make the point that minimum wage is an artificial constraint. He was basically like, the minimum wage in apartheid South Africa worked against the black taxi drivers to hurt them. And I was like, that's interesting, Grover Norquist, because The Nation had an article saying that you oppose divestment from South Africa, and he flipped his shit. And like after the show was like screaming at me as the elevator doors were closing and he was going down, and he was like, where were you? What did you do? And like, if listeners don't know, I think I was probably 8 during the time has been playing. Yeah. But like, it just makes me think, like, the Tea Party, if people really like if there had been video cameras back then and it had been live streamed, you know what I mean? Like, what would have been the reaction to that? And would we still think about it in this very, very rosy way that we think about it now? Or is it just because it happens to fit into right wingers' political, mold that they're willing to forgive it and overlook it?
Yeah.
Like, which of those two things do you think it is, Jesse?
Well, I think it's like victory really helps, right? Like
that's a good point.
Nobody condemns like Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian fruit seller, for like selling fruit without a license, which is what the cops busted him for, because like then he set himself on fire, and then the Tunisian rebellion like won, or like at least was able to oust Ben Ali. So like, I mean, if you like do some smashy shit and then you win and you're the victor and you get to write the history, then like it's basically forgiven. But if it's the bad people who do it, then it's just, condemnation. I have a question about something that bad people do, which is travel business class. You wrote a thing about this in Medium.
Yes. So, listeners of the show know that there is a woman known as Wall Street Alexis. She sometimes shows up. And Wall Street Alexis used to fly business class. I flew on British Airways and Virgin Atlantic, and people should know that it's probably even worse than you imagine in terms of like catering to elite assholes. And I wrote an article called Business Travel is for Classholes, and just talked a little bit about what it's like to fly Virgin Atlantic upper class. And that is what they call it. They call it upper class.
Upper class.
Yeah. And so it is literally as different to normal air travel as you can imagine. There is a free taxi that picks you up when you go to the airport. It picks you up when you arrive at the airport and takes you to your destination. And then when you are flying home, I was flying out of Heathrow, they drive you into what they call this drive-in check-in. You get out of your taxi. There's 2 people with clipboards that are helping you check in. They take your bags. You have a separate security line that has basically nobody in the line. You fly through the separate security line, and then you are immediately greeted with the real security line. And you walk past the real security line, having already cleared through security yourself, and watch hundreds of people in line sighing and exasperated and pulling their hair out. So it's not just that your experience is better, it's that your experience is better, and then you are immediately confronted with how awful everyone else's experience is. And then, you go off to this lounge, and this lounge has free massages. There is a hot tub. I'm not kidding. There's a whole spa.
Hot tub?
There's a hot tub. Yeah.
I can't imagine going to the airport and going to a secret place and then removing my clothing in order to sit and relax. Like, just fucking stay at home and take a goddamn bath, and then you can get to the airport on time.
There's a barber shop. You can get a free haircut. There's a free full bar, a pool table. Anyway, and then you get on the plane, and then when the plane lands, the crew literally stands with their arms like against the seats, blocking the economy passengers from leaving until everyone from upper class has left the plane. So in the piece, I quote this guy who is mentioned in Michael Lewis's book, Flash Boys. His name is Jeremy Frommer. He's a huge idiot. Like, he doesn't understand how technology works according to Flash Boys. Like, he thinks typing something into a piece of trading software is the same thing as actually executing the trade. Like, he has a kind of basic misunderstanding about how technology works. But that aside, he told business students at SUNY Albany, which is his alma mater, it's not enough just to fly first class. I have to know my friends are flying in coach. And I basically feel like the entire business class experience is catering to that guy, because it's not just that you're treated better, it's that you're treated better, and then when you exit the plane, you can see the people in economy being treated worse. You get to the airport, you walk by the people in economy going through the regular security line. So it's not just about separatism, it's about separatism that is visible, and it's about being an asshole in a very visible way and making yourself feel elite in comparison to the way other people are treated poorly.
Yeah, two things on that. One is that it dovetails with a thing that Barbara and Karen Fields write in Racecraft, which is a book I've talked about before, about how it wasn't really segregation. It was like segregation integration. It was like people being together in ways that enforce the superiority of one over the other. And the other thing is bringing in Chris Hayes and fractal inequality, because what happens when you just completely seclude rich people is that they can't see who they're ahead of. They can only see who they're behind. So like Davos, he quotes Anya Schifrin, Joe Stiglitz's wife, is with that wonderful quotation about how the whole thing's based on like mass paranoia and humiliation. People are all convinced, these extremely successful business people are convinced that they've been shut out of the coolest events and the most prestigious private parties and stuff like that. Whereas so you might like foster that by simply segregating the rich people. You put them all in a lounge and they're convinced that there's an even better lounge. But if you then parade them past the plebeians, they're like, I'm doing pretty good. Look at these assholes.
That's a great point. That is a great point. And that is exactly, I think, why people will shell over $4,000, $5,000, which is what these tickets cost. At least when I was flying, they're probably more now. For something that, like you said, like you could just take a bath at home. Like, now granted, the lounge is nice, like I'm not gonna lie, but like, it's not $5,000 nice, even if you're a super, super rich person. Like, wouldn't you rather buy a pool table with $5,000 than use a pool table in the lounge? But yeah, like there must be something deeply reassuring to these rich people who are constantly comparing themselves to other rich people to see, oh good, you know what? I'm still above all of these other people.
Phew.
And so that is why business travel is for class holes.
And class holes, I'll just transition into the last one here. Class holes are also idiots. Like, this is like one of the things. So in society, like we've talked, even last time we were talking about how society, all the many ways in which society values rich people more and is constantly reinforcing rich people's views of themselves as superior and as champions. But the main thing, or maybe not the main thing, but a central thing that we do, also something that Chris Hayes writes about in Twilight of the Elites, is we convince ourselves and rich people that they're richer because they're smarter, right? Like, like the reason that we have to pay finance bros so much money is that they're so fucking smart and they all went through Harvard and they get all this complex quantitative stuff and they're like so smart. And we have this kind of like cult of smart where like, even, and it becomes so obviously gendered and racialized. Like when we were talking about when Elena Kagan, I remember, was being nominated for the Supreme Court, obviously like an extremely brilliant woman with like an amazing mind for law, like whatever you think of her political policies, like obviously she cannot be accused of being unsmart, except that is exactly what the right wing was accusing her of. They were like, well, she's never produced any like transformative literature in the field and she doesn't have a legal doctrine that is completely, and it's like basically the cult of smart is super like wrapped up with all of the stuff that we were talking about evaluating wealthy people above everybody else. And For this reason, and the main place I think where this plays out is in terms of markets and investors, like the wisdom of the market and the wisdom of investors, and they're going to like the stock market is going to find the socially optimal investment pursuits for the nation's like economic surplus. But really, who we're entrusting to do this is just these rich people who are as susceptible to rumor, prejudice, irrationality, fear, panic as anybody else. And so, as Hamilton Nolan reports, he reports some quotations from Robert Shiller, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and his article in Gawker is called "Is the Stock Market Driven Mainly by Bullshit?" And I think it really is. I mean, the quotation from Shiller is, "People are stupid and irrational sometimes, and finance is run by people. Therefore, finance in the stock market and business world and will also be stupid sometimes. No big surprise." And that's totally true. Like, why invest in this and not that? Well, because rumor, because I saw that guy doing it and we sort of run with the flock. Or like, why, like, for instance, why are the business people all about austerity? When if there was like robust public stimulus and the government was pumping money into everybody's hands, they would have a shit ton of more money to like spend on stuff and profits would just absolutely boom. The economy would be going gangbusters. So why do they support austerity? Well, because they're just like everybody else, susceptible to rumor, but powered by ideology, not especially rational, don't understand the thing very well because they're idiots, any number of reasons for them to believe that this thing that's obviously so socially disastrous and doesn't amplify profits appreciably, at least, is the way to go. So, Alexis, you've been around more rich finance people than me. Like, are there just like a bunch of idiots making decisions that, turn out so embarrassingly bad?
Well, yes and no. I definitely think that there are a lot of idiots on Wall Street. I do think that the traders, for the most part, that I worked with pretty complicated mathematical models, and most of them were like PhDs in math, and a lot of them went to this one particular school out of France. But I do think that the stock market as a whole is driven by herd behavior. I think that's pretty well established. And that's the reason that trading strategies like something that's called trend following works, which is basically, everyone's going to just copy each other. So when you start to notice a trend, just follow it. And then the minute the trend starts to go back, cut your losses and walk away. Even if, it starts to go back up again, oh, well, you walk away. And the problem is that people are greedy. And when they start to lose money, they don't want to think that they're wrong. So they'll hold on to their losses and then get themselves into trouble. But I do think that it's either just kind of this basic herd mentality and everybody's greedy and they want to do what everybody else is doing, or they find ways to kind of cheat, right? Which is a big part of what high frequency trading is all about. It's just like, how can I beat the exchange at their own game? How can I send a flood of orders so fast that I know the exchange won't have time to process them, but it's enough to start to nudge the price one direction or the other? And so because this whole like herd behavior is so strong, the way that a lot of people make money is to try to figure out little cheats around the fringes and the margins. But I do think that for the most part, the stock market is bullshit. If there is one rich person I do think I would give credit to, I would probably give credit to Warren Buffett, because what that dude does is he just literally reads every single piece of paper that like a company he's interested in puts out. And most people are way too lazy for that. They just want to turn on CNBC, like the retired dentist, the racist retired dentist, I should say, that watch CNBC. If you read their comment section, that is what you can divine from that. They just want to like pick up the Wall Street Journal or Investors Business Daily, read one article and have a hot stock tip. I do think there are a handful of people who really do their research, but they really are a handful of people. And for the most part, yes, it is bullshit driving the stock market.
Yeah. So like whether the stock market hinges on like laziness or idiocy or herd mentality or whatever, the obvious takeaway is that clearly the stock market is not the optimal way of taking the economic surplus, the profits of society, and putting them toward their most socially useful investment.
And I should say just one last thing, which is the guys that I worked with were traders that I worked with are very smart, but they also had millions of dollars that they could trade with. And there are trading strategies that work because you have millions of dollars. And it doesn't matter how smart you are. if you don't have millions of dollars, that strategy isn't going to work. And to some extent, it's almost like if you have millions of dollars and like all the amazing technology that these firms have, like it's kind of hard not to make money. So it's not, I do think that they're smart. I wouldn't really say that they weren't, but it's also like they're not geniuses, and I wouldn't certainly compare them to Justice Elena Kagan or, Sonia Sotomayor or anyone like that. If anything, they're just privileged and smart.
Yeah, privileged and smart. You can get smart if you're privileged. All right. Well, that was our A-D-H-DisCon, our first time doing that. I think it went pretty well. Hopefully listeners stayed with us and didn't feel like we were careening our car too violently left and right on the road. Let us know what you thought of the new segment, and we'll get into your interview next. Alexis, what's the interview?
So next up, I speak with Eugene Puryear, who is running for the D.C. City Council, which actually in the district is just called the Council because the District of Columbia is basically a colony under imperialist rule.
The council. Council of the district.
But we get into a lot of really cool, wonky solutions. So stick around. That's up next. Very happy to welcome to the show Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an activist and organizer in Washington, D.C., and is running for the at-large seat on the D.C. Council. You can follow Eugene on Twitter at EUGENE4DC, and the campaign website is eugenepuryear.com, and Puryear is spelled Puryear. Eugene, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Awesome. No, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
So, Eugene, I wanted to start off asking you, why are you running for the D.C. Council? Like, what inspired you to take this up? I understand it's a very crowded race. There are a lot of people running for it. I believe there are 2 open seats. Mm-hmm. So what was your journey getting here, and what are you hoping to achieve in the race and in your term on the D.C. Council?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what drove me was frustration. I felt that for those of us who've been active in social justice struggles in the District of Columbia, we were so consistently running up against a brick wall, and every recess that came around complaining that the council didn't do this, the council didn't do that, they should have done this, they should have done that, the mayor, the same thing. And at a certain point, we have to stop, and this is my estimation, and with those who we were discussing during the campaign, we have to stop just waiting for other people to represent us and saying they're representing us poorly. We need to start representing ourselves. And there are 15 people in this race. At that point, there was not even close to that because there was still another incumbent, David Catania, who's now running for mayor and had to give up his seat. And I just said, you know what? People don't want to take on incumbents in D.C. We know that there's this need. There seems to be no one else progressive on the horizon who's going to jump in this race. So you know what? If it has to be done and I don't see anyone else doing it, I'm happy to do it. I'm willing to do it. And I think it's been great. So it was really just a frustration with the complete inadequacy and to a large degree unresponsiveness of the D.C. Council towards the need of poor working people. And they only represent the big corporations, the millionaires, and that's who get the meetings. The lobbyists are running all in there. And I was just tired of it. We have to either, we're in the top 5 in the District of Columbia in income inequality in the whole country, which, is the United States of America. So, it tells you a sense of that amount of wealth. And the fact that we still have an unbelievable homeless problem, we have shelters that are in terrible conditions, we're in an affordable housing crisis where people making $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year are having trouble finding places to live. We have job training programs where people get quote unquote trained and never get jobs. Unemployment is maybe over 20% in wards 7 and 8, which are traditionally black, working class, oppressed communities. And it just, we have to change our direction, because if it keeps going this way, the District of Columbia is only going to be a playground for the super rich.
So I want to ask you specifically about the playground for the super rich, because as someone who's relatively new to DC, I was in New York. I grew up in Maryland, so DC looked very different when I was growing up in Maryland. It used to be a minority city, and now we've sort of broken through, and I think, white people are increasingly a presence here, and people are getting pushed out. And so I'm curious, what do you see as the solution to that? Obviously, gentrification is a problem that is not unique to DC, and it's not one that has perhaps maybe a an easy solution, but what do you see as the way to ensure that there is affordable housing and just a place for everyone to continue to live in the District of Columbia, even as it continues to change to become a playground for the super rich, at least as it has been in the last few years?
Well, I think there's a few things we can do. And the first thing I'd say is we need to eliminate poverty wages in the District of Columbia. The fact of the matter is that for a single person with no kids in DC, it's about $13 an hour is what a living wage would be. And we're not even going to get there by 2016 with the most recent minimum wage rise. And it actually will be about $1.50 off, I believe, at the end.
Where are we at right now? Because I know there was just
Right. Right now we're at $10.50, and we're going to go to $11.50. And that's where and then that's more or less where it's going to end up. There's some people who want to take it to $12.50. Maybe that could come up in a ballot measure sometime soon. We don't really know. There is going to be a campaign for $15 an hour. I'm pushing for $15 an hour. The reality is, if $13 is a living wage, I don't know how we can go any less than that, especially over this number of years where it doesn't keep track with inflation. So by the time you get there, it doesn't even really make a difference in the lives of working people.
Can I just ask you quickly, just to interject? So where does that 13 come from? Like, what's
the MIT Living Wage Calculator, which calculates for every municipality, state, and county what the living wage would be. And they basically look at it as the bare minimum to get food, clothing, shelter, childcare. That's more or less what they look at. They also look at travel costs. It's all broken down. No matter where you live in the country, I would say spend like 10, 15 minutes looking at the MIT Living Wage Calculator. It will change the whole way you look at wages and employment from my perspective. So that's one big piece, is we not only need to have people making better wages who are already working, we also need to put more people in work. And that's a little bit of a broader question. I mean, I think there's a lot of things we have to do. Just a few, I think we need to really jumpstart, not just going, because right now what happens in the District of Columbia, big corporations use it as like an ATM machine. And they come in, they ask for these tax breaks, even if they have tons of money and they don't need it. It's like an extortion scam. And I think we need to find ways to empower our local people to put together local small businesses that meet the needs of the community, that are serving the needs of the community. Co-ops, for instance, that are not traditional sort of capitalist-oriented enterprises, although they do operate in a capitalist system. Things like that can empower local people. And for example, we could create a DC public bank. Take the $2 billion DC invests right now currently in Wall Street banks, DC money, bring it back here to the District of Columbia, create a public bank that would then partner with small local banks and credit unions and leverage their capital for things like affordable housing and small business development.
Can you elaborate a little bit on where that $2 billion is coming from? Like, is there an economic development corporation, or where is that money coming from the district, and how does it get into the pockets of the banks?
So it's basically just all the money the district brings in and holds. So tax money, which then oftentimes goes right back out, any sort of savings that are coming in from different things district are doing, just money that the district somehow has and is holding, surplus money, that kind of thing. And they invest it with the big banks, who allegedly, from their perspective, those are the quote unquote professionals. They're the only people who know how to do it, and so on and so forth. But it's a huge waste of our money. We're missing out on a lot of opportunities, and I think that's a big thing. It would be a huge new pool of capital that we could leverage to, what I think, in places that are depressed areas, really jumpstart economic development there without having to have tax giveaways to some big Fortune 500 company and beg them to come there to pay people a poverty wage job. The other thing with housing in DC is that we don't do enough to protect what we have. I mean, our rent control law you can increase the rent every year, cost of living plus 2%, which means over 20 years rents would triple. So what's the point of having a rent control law that's going to triple rents? I mean, it does the opposite of what it's supposed to do, and it's only on buildings built before the mid 1970s. And so we have to look at how we put it on all units, and in a way that I believe should be measured by fiat on maybe a 3-year, 5-year basis that's more consistent with what the cost of living is and what it really costs for people to be in DC. So that's one big piece. We need to spend more money in general on affordable housing programs. We need to use tools we have that we don't already use, like the District Opportunity to Purchase program, where the district can go in and buy low-income buildings that are never going to be able to get a loan for tenants to buy it, even though they have the right to do it when the owner sells it, and then rent it back to them to keep affordability in a lot of these areas that are rapidly gentrifying. So there's a lot of different pieces we can do. And on my website, people can see we have a whole housing platform, and it's within our grasp to stop gentrification, but only if we're willing to put the money into housing and to put the work into creating an economy that really privileges the needs of people to have the basics in life, as opposed to, big ticket economic development, quote unquote, that is really just aimed at getting some person in the mayor's office a job in some big corporation through the revolving door.
I do want to ask you one specific question, and this comes out of a conversation that I had with friend of the show, Aaron Goggins, but I understand that there's a housing trust fund for the District of Columbia, and that the tenant laws here are pretty good, and that there's opportunities for tenants to basically buy out their landlord, and that the housing trust fund, at least in theory, is supposed to either be able to give grants or low interest loans to tenants who might want to organize and buy out their landlord rather than them, kicking everybody out by raising the rents and turning into condos. And there's been a call to action that I saw to get $100 million into the trust fund, and I'm curious, what is your position on that, and what do you think of the trust fund, and is there something that should be done differently with it? And
Yeah, I mean, I think the trust fund is an important tool. I think oftentimes it gets overplayed as kind of the only tool. I support the $100 million, and I think we're in a position where we're going to get that, although I think it's still too low. I mean, Mayor Gray last year put in about $187 million and only created a few thousand units. So we're going to need to move bigger than that. So I definitely support the $100 million. I think it was a good goal that was set by housing advocates and raised a lot of consciousness around the production trust fund. But part of the problem, so it's called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. TOPA is how people refer to it in DC, is, there's way more tenant associations who want TOPA money to purchase their building than they're really able to. And part of the issue is it kind of depends on who you are. I mean, a lot of low income buildings, for instance, and this is why DOPA, the District Opportunity to Purchase Act, is important. A lot of low income buildings say everyone in there is barely making it anyway. It's going to be very difficult to get a loan from a bank. And so they're going to need more money from the district. And then they're going to have to, so it just becomes something that becomes a compounding issue. So I believe that we should shoot for more than $100 million. I don't know if I want to put a number on it because I think there's so many other things we have to do. Like we have our local rent supplement program, which I think is, maybe sort of ideologically the least savory tool because it's basically just a voucher program where you're paying the difference between what people can pay and the market rate rent, which is a way to get people in apartments, but it's also kind of doesn't really speak to the issue of the rents being way too high. And so it's sort of an unsustainable program, but it's a tool. District Opportunity to Purchase Act, which I think is one of the best tools that we don't use. They haven't even finalized the rules on how to use it yet. I think because of how effective it could be. We're in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods where a lot of the affordable housing stock are buildings that may not be in the greatest shape, and people there definitely aren't making much of any money. And developers, owners, landlords want to sell them to capitalize. And those situations where tenants, it's very unlikely that tenants are going to be able to really put together the financing to do these deals. The district can come in, buy the building, renovate the building, and rent it out to them still at low income. So there's a lot of tools we can use, but definitely I think we should get to that $100 million and keep pushing forward on that.
So I want to go in a slightly different direction now and talk about your political ideology and identity. And I understand that you identify as a socialist. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about how you arrived at that position and kind of, your maybe a little bit about your political history and the journey that led you to that particular political identity.
Yeah, I became an activist in high school around the war in Iraq. I was about 16 or 17. I was 17. We let a walkout at my high school, and I became interested in a lot of different political topics. I've been interested in politics for sure, absolutely, and my father was involved in the civil rights movement. But it wasn't until the war against Iraq where I really sort of jumped into the opposition movement to that war that I really started to think more about politics, getting involved in politics, the ability to make change through politics. And with having a background rooted in, a lot of the black radical movements of the 60s and the 70s and hearing a lot about that coming up, I was honestly kind of drawn to socialism pretty quickly because when you start to intersect with a lot of those writings, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, I mean, any of these people we can name, the issue of socialism comes up very quickly. The issue of communism, Marx, all these different things, they all are sort of in there, so you better find out something about it. And so as I started to just study these writings from the Black liberation movement, it started to just make sense to me that there's all these problems that exist in our society. There's so many of them. But when you boil them down to the essence, what it really comes down to is that we live in a society where private profit and property rights are valued over people's needs. And it just seemed to me like, well, what kind of sense does that make? I mean, we have all this technological know-how, intellectual know-how, resources, not just money, but just, human resources, all these things that are built up. We know how to do. I mean, it's not like we couldn't feed everyone, for instance. It's not like we couldn't house anyone. The only reason we don't is because people can't make money doing it. And so for me, it seemed like we had to move away from that profit system. And it brought me to socialism, and I am a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and I write at liberationnews.org, our website. During the campaign, I have not really been blogging, so if you go and look, don't blame me for having not blogged in a couple months. But after November 4th, I'll be right back on there. And it just led me to believe that we had to do something. I had to get involved in a movement, in the socialist movement that was trying to move away from that. We'll fight for, and all socialists and communists say this, we'll fight for every little gain, but with the horizon that we have to change the system. And it was really attractive to me because it spoke to what I wanted to do on an everyday basis, which is to fight all these ills, these fights, these struggles that we're in, but also recognizing that I don't want to fight forever. I want to solve the problems. I want to get to a place where we aren't thinking about homelessness, hunger, poverty, where we're thinking about other challenges. How do we, get rid of 100% of cancer and HIV/AIDS, and how are we gonna, do all these new technological things, that we're really reaching new frontiers. And I mean, it was Martin Luther King who said that the three biggest evils were militarism, racism, and poverty, and we're still afflicted by those today, and we got to get beyond that. And I think socialism, which I view ultimately as a transitional society, we've lived in class society for 5,000 years, and there are a lot of different things that exist, especially the oppression of women, for instance, that are so deeply rooted in these thousands of years of oppression, that I do believe we need a transitional system that starts to set up a society that doesn't run off profit. But ultimately, I do think that we need communism. I do think we should. I mean, all the other things we can do, we can send a person to the moon, but we can't figure out how to live together amongst each other and make sure that our collective talents and resources are used for the maximum benefit of everyone. That strikes me as completely absurd. And so that's pretty much what brought me there, was just the logic of feeling like, there is a basic contradiction, and it's the fact that it's profit over people everywhere you turn, and that no, it doesn't have to be that way. History's never always been that way, and the socialist movement has been pointing the way for some time to a society that prioritizes people's needs over profit, and that's what I wanted to be with, and I'm proud to be someone now who identifies in that way.
So speaking of prioritizing profits over people's needs, I know you were recently up at the People's Climate March. Naomi Klein has a new book out where she's talking about capitalism versus the climate and how the two are somewhat irreconcilable if we want to save the climate. What can the district be doing differently in order to try to combat climate change?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a few things we need to do, and I'll just lead with the first, which is maybe the boldest, but I think the most important. We need to take PepCo, which is currently a publicly regulated private company, so it's not public, and we need to turn it into a public energy utility. I mean, if you look at PepCo, which is now just in the process of being bought by Exelon, big nuclear power company out of Chicago, they're wedded to a model that no longer works, which is based on large power plants far away from urban areas, connected through long transmission lines, which I won't get deep into, but it's very inefficient, whatever. Now, with the increase of microgrid technology, which is growing quickly, changes in battery technology, what we're seeing is that a lot of our clean energy in our urban areas can be created right where we are and can be scaled up pretty quickly on a neighborhood or sort of regional-ish basis in urban areas. And I think we need to look more towards that. But until we have public control over our utilities, there's no way a company that is combining with another company only to keep their waning business model alive. And even the Washington Post says the business model is becoming antiquated. There's no way that they're going to be really open to radical changes that promote clean energy that are going to completely disrupt their profit model. They are responsible to shareholders. They have to maximize shareholder value. And I'm sure listeners to your show there is no secret that often doesn't lead to positive outcomes. And I think that if we don't do that, we can't do anything else. And once we do that, I think there's a lot of different things we can do. I mean, right now, for example, where I live in Ward 8, which is a neighborhood, DC's divided up into 8 wards, you've got an old hospital that they're now trying to turn into a big development. They want to put a trigeneration plant there. Also close to there is a place called Blue Plains, which is where all our solid waste goes. They're now getting half of their energy in Blue Plains from solid waste that they're turning into energy. We also have some solar co-ops that have been popping up in our neighborhood. We're about to get solar panels on my house. So right there in just this one area, which is considered one of the poorest, most impoverished areas, we have a potential to maybe even create a demonstration project for a microgrid to show how we can use solar, solid waste, trigeneration, whatever else we can come up with to start to generate more power that is more reliable, certainly for microgrids, that is clean, and that can be done and replicated in neighborhoods across across the district. I also think that we have to recognize a lot of different facts. I mean, one fact, for instance, is that we always talk about cars and so on and so forth. That's very important in terms of carbon emissions. In the district, 74%, maybe 75%. Go to my website and fact check me on that. It's on there. And of our emissions are coming from buildings. So we have to encourage, well, one, we need to retrofit more buildings that are older, and that's a great place for green jobs. Many people know about that. Secondly, I would say we need to adopt some best practices from other places. Like San Francisco has something called priority permitting, which is basically if you agree to build LEED Gold, you jump to the front of the line and all the permitting and licensing and stuff like that it takes to build something. And in the District of Columbia, there is a lot of red tape. And I think that would be a very big boon to builders if they said, oh, it's going to cost me more money, but I'm going to be able to build this building right now and cut through a lot of this nonsense that you have to deal with. And I think that would be big for us. You know, Pittsburgh has something called a density bonus. I'm sort of less excited about that because I think the constant push for more density is often misguided in urban planning. But that being said, I think in the most general sense, it's not a bad concept to think of bonuses, density bonuses or whatever. We can't have height bonuses in DC because of the Height Act, but different things we can do where if you agree to build to LEED Gold, you're going to be able to do this that no one else can do. We need to do things that sort of jumpstart people to try to make their buildings more sustainable. And then we also have to be willing to pump more district dollars into training for retrofitting and things like that. The Green New Deal concept, as people call it, to go around and we have a lot of older housing stock in the district, and we could probably do quite a bit to retrofit to move things down. I think the district should also divest from fossil fuels. There's a divestment bill in front of the council. Obviously, ExxonMobil's not going to go down if DC divests, but I think more important than the impact on the companies per se of the district doing it, it's the ripple effect. And I think it's also the moral argument. Like, obviously there will be a ripple effect. This is the nation's capital. It makes it more legitimate for other people to do it if we do it. But also it just sort of raises the flag. Like, why are we investing our money in these companies that are destroying the earth? You only have one planet. Humanity cannot survive under any and all circumstances. And so either we're going to practice what we preach or we're not. And it gives us an opportunity, I think, to really put these companies in the spotlight because they're not just some benign corporation. Maybe no big corporation is benign, but you know what I mean? Like the way they're presented, it's almost like sometimes with these divestment bills, like you're picking on them or something. They're destroying the planet. Yeah. And I think it gives us a good opportunity.
I want to ask you about transportation next, because as I mentioned, I've recent transplanted DC from New York, and you can imagine me shaking my fist at the metro. And it's a very expensive public transportation system here. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on transportation and how we can make public transportation better, more accessible, more affordable?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. And to start with WMATA, I mean, the biggest problem with the WMATA and the biggest issue with the cost...
And sorry, just to interrupt, that is the...
Washington Metropolitan Area Transportation Authority. Apologies, the DC. You talk at all these forums and all the little acronyms and buzzwords. You forget you have to explain them. And the thing about WMATA is that there's no dedicated funding source. And so the jurisdictions are Virginia, Maryland, and the district, as well as the federal government. And the way they put the money together is essentially on an ad hoc basis. And unlike New York and almost every other major public transit system where they have a significant dedicated funding source and can do long-term planning, Metro can't really do long-term planning because they have no idea if they'll actually have the money to do things. And it also means that a huge portion of the money they bring in to operate the system has to come from fares, which is why the fares constantly go up and they're calculated in the most ridiculous way. I mean, when you go to New York, it's crazy that there's a flat fare that you could go double the distance in DC and pay $1, sometimes almost $2 less. If you actually leave to go to Maryland or Virginia, you'd probably pay $3 or $4 more than what you would pay in a flat fee in New York City. And so really the riders are getting price gouged, which has the opposite effect because it makes people less likely to take public transportation. So I think there's two pieces. In terms of WMATA, the toughest piece is that it's not just controlled by DC. So there's someone on the DC Council represents DC on the board, and we need that person to be a more aggressive advocate for a dedicated funding source. These are three of the richest jurisdictions: Virginia, Maryland, DC, all very rich. Federal government, plenty of money. It makes no sense that there's no dedicated funding source. There just isn't the political will there. So we need that. But in terms of what we can control in the District of Columbia, I think there are some things we can do. Now, the streetcar is out there. I am pretty much on record as not being in favor of the streetcar. Not because I think it's a bad idea, but I think that they didn't really have a plan and they've been wasting money. I mean, there was go ahead.
And again, just for those outside of DC, what's the streetcar?
They're trying to build a streetcar system all over DC, a light rail type system. They've only built it on one street. And it's been kind of a white elephant project. It's taken years longer than they said. It still hasn't opened. I mean, I remember hearing about this like 5 years ago, and still it's almost like it's 5 years ago. I mean, it's out there. It's ready to go on this one street, but they still haven't started it. They're testing it or whatever. But when they were looking at it this past year for the budget, they found there was $100 million sitting in a bank account that had been appropriated to the streetcar, just collecting dust, because they don't actually know how they're going to carry out the plan to build it in all the places they want to build it. And so from my perspective, should we be outlaying huge sums of money when we have a number of very pressing human rights needs and other transportation needs in the District of Columbia where we know what they are and we know what we need to do? Or should we be just giving huge sums of money to the Department of Transportation, who doesn't really know what they want to do, to build this streetcar where there are a lot of unknowns? I think we need to run it where it is now and revisit the whole thing before we start appropriating more money. And I do think that what we can do is bus rapid transit. We know how to do it. It doesn't cost money. There's already plans in place. K Street, Georgia Avenue, 16th Street, and it's been proven that this will actually save us money. Some people say bus rapid transit won't have a big impact. It would have a huge impact. It would make more people ride the bus, without a doubt, and it helps create the cultural change we need, because a lot of it is, yes, public transportation is inefficient, so on and so forth, but it's also just a different kind of lifestyle to drive everywhere as opposed to taking public transit everywhere. So you have to try to find multiple entry points for people to start taking public transit, and I think all over the district, if we had more rapid bus lanes, which we could definitely do, which would definitely happen more quickly and could definitely be done cheaper, we would be able to get a big push. I think also our circulator system, which is like it's sort of a dedicated bus that it's like different than the general bus that goes everywhere, that goes specific places. We can use our circulator, because the big thing with the streetcar is for people who live what's called east of the river, which it's literally two neighborhoods that are actually east of the river. It's hard for them to get downtown where there are a lot of jobs. And people say, oh, well, we need a streetcar. First of all, the streetcar doesn't even go there right now anyway, and they don't even know when it will. But secondly, we can set up a circulator route for much cheaper. That's like an express lane that goes from some of the main metro stations right downtown. And it'd be essentially like hopping into your car, and however long that takes, which is going to be less than if you take the metro or you take a normal bus that's making a lot of different stops. So I think those are some of the things we could do. And then also continuing to aggressively advocate for more dedicated funding for the metro, the subway in DC. And so we can not only just have it be a better system, but have it be a more expansive system, which will, ultimately, if you really want to increase people riding public transit, you need to increase the underground heavy rail. And if we're not talking about that seriously, then we're not really talking.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about is, I know that you've written a book on mass incarceration, and I saw that recently in July, so there's this campaign called Ban the Box, and it's basically about trying to ban literally a box on an employment form asking if you have a criminal background, which is obviously discriminatory when you take into account that mass incarceration in the United States is discriminatory. But there's a class action lawsuit right now against WMATA, basically alleging that they are discriminating against people based on them either being returning citizens, which, if listeners don't know, is the term for folks who've been incarcerated. What is the campaign's position on Ban the Box, but also this class action lawsuit, and just more generally, if you'd like to talk about mass incarceration and how it fits into what you're hoping to bring to the DC Council?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question. I was the co-founder with a number of returning citizens of the Jobs Not Jails Coalition, and this is one of the things, Ban the Box, that I like to say we worked on Ban the Box before it was cool, before all the politicians jumped on the bandwagon this year. But hey, it's cool. I'm happy to have them there because we were able to get something passed. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. Ultimately, I think that, well, to start with the lawsuit, I'm 100% in support of the lawsuit. It's pretty obvious that WMATA is tightening the screws on returning citizens, and traditionally they were relatively liberal towards bringing in returning citizens as employees, and that was a sort of a section of people in the District of Columbia that were able to get jobs with the metro system even though they had criminal records. I don't fully know what's behind this. There have been a lot of investigations over the past few years about there being a lot of nepotism and just different types of chicanery in the hiring for Metro. And I have a feeling that is what it's really related to. I mean, it's obviously discriminatory, but I think it may be discriminatory on two levels to also keep more DC residents out of employment. not just people with criminal records, and maybe perhaps even PG County. It's difficult to know what's going on down there in the Jackson Graham building, which is their headquarters. And, the Washington Times, however terrible their editorial perspective, did lift up the covers, I think it was a couple years ago, on the hiring being basically nonsensical in terms of everyone in certain jobs getting hired only from certain constituencies, jobs going unfilled for months and months and months, even though qualified people were applying. So clearly there's something going on there, and I hope this lawsuit can bring that out a little bit, and I definitely support it, and I'm glad people took it up. Ban the box is crucial. And my book is Shackled and Chained. You can get it at shackledandchained.com. And, when the judge bangs the gavel, he doesn't say you get 20 years in prison, then when you get out, you won't be able to find a job or a place to live or anything like that. And it makes it so difficult for people to actually re-enter into our society and, make something of themselves, to start a whole new life, because there's so many bends and twists and turns and people who are discriminating against you because of that history. And I think that ultimately, ban the box in DC, which we've done partially, we're going to need to go a little further, for sure. Right now, what you can do in the district is you can't ask about someone's criminal record until you first offer them the job conditionally. I think you shouldn't be able to ask at all. I mean, I just don't believe that just a completely arbitrary judgment by a business owner should determine whether or not you're able to restart your life. I mean, you're innocent until proven guilty. Just because you robbed someone doesn't mean you're going to rob that restaurant. And to treat you as if you will is absurdly discriminatory in my view. I mean, many Malcolm X is the perfect example of someone like this, who was able to completely reclaim their life and is now one of the most celebrated figures in American history. He has a stamp. So ultimately, I think we have to recognize that fact and ban it all the way. We have to ban it in housing. Housing is more discriminatory than employment. I definitely see way more employers who are willing to give a chance to people with criminal records than you see apartment complexes. I mean, I have a misdemeanor arrest. I think it's actually now expunged, but several years back, there was a misdemeanor arrest I had from a protest crossing a police line, something that thousands of people in DC have, for sure. Millions of people across the country. Extremely minor. I was denied an apartment for that reason, which just seemed shocking to me. And I showed them the documentation, what it was about. That was a post and forfeit, which happens all the time in DC. I had a lawyer write a letter. Didn't matter. And it's more discriminatory in housing, and that's going to be a tougher road to hoe, but that's something I want to look at. I think the other thing we have to look at is our war on drugs. I support Initiative 71 to legalize marijuana in the District of Columbia. I mean, I think there's no reason from a medical perspective, from a health perspective, a public health perspective, that cigarettes and alcohol should be legal and marijuana shouldn't. I think obviously there's a tax issue there, and I think there's a huge criminal justice issue there. And here's something that's key. A lot of people in DC are saying, well, decriminalization will do everything that legalization will do because it'll be a misdemeanor. And I have to say that that's completely false. Because what was revealed when decriminalization was passed, and the reason it happened, is that all of the people getting arrested by and large were black people. They were getting arrested by and large only in certain communities, and by and large these were non-violent criminals, and 54% of them, I believe, were never charged with another crime, which means that they were just... So essentially what I'm trying to say is what was revealed is when people know about stop and frisk in New York, is that there's almost definitely a de facto stop and frisk operating in DC, and they were using marijuana odor as a way to stop people. And they use a lot of different pretextual stops. Now, theoretically, pretextual stops are legal, but they're extremely prejudicial. So, I've talked to many people about this. Any little thing they could find, and it's massively, heavily around the marijuana odor piece. And so even with a ticket, people can still be harassed. And I think we have to legalize marijuana because clearly, one of the biggest pieces of what I view as an extreme violation of people's civil rights, this de facto stop and frisk that does exist in DC, a huge part of it is related to marijuana and marijuana odor. And I think that is a key piece that we should be thinking about in terms of legalization. So we have to look at that as well, and the other natures of the failed war on drugs. We do have to look, I think, at decriminalizing prostitution. I mean, we're, a lot of LGBTQ youth, for example, especially trans people, oftentimes when they're forced out of their homes or in places that they live because they aren't accepted for who they are, they do have to take up sex work. And I think in the same way you don't want a 17-year-old who gets caught with weed to have their whole life ruined, I don't think a 17-year-old who is forced out onto the street because of bigotry against the trans people or LGBTQ folks in general should also have their life completely ruined by having criminal charges put on them. And I think we have to stop looking at our problems in the District of Columbia and in the nation at large. Policing is really just managing social problems, and we're not looking at how we solve social problems.
That's a great point. I haven't heard it put exactly that way. Policing is managing social problems.
Yeah, no, and I think we got to solve the problem. We can't just contain it. But it's easier for the powers that be, the 1%, if you will. It's much easier for them to just put a ring fence around it with prisons and police and try to keep a lid on the thing than challenge the whole system, which is what you'd have to do if you really wanted to solve these problems. Well,
Eugene, I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but I think that's all the time we have for this segment. But everyone should know that if you want to learn more about the campaign, again, one more time, you can follow Eugene, the number 4, and then DC on Twitter. And the website is eugenepuryear.com. And again, Puryear spelled Puryear. Eugene, thanks so much for joining us today.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me, Alexis. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. That does it for this edition of Disorderly Conduct. Please make sure that you follow us on Twitter and do tweet at us too at DIS_CON.
And don't forget to like us on Facebook and subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher and fave us on OkCupid. And if you like us, please rate us on iTunes or Stitcher. It really helps. All right, people, we're out of here.